Starting off at number 10 is D2. It's one of those Dreamcast games that's incredibly difficult to describe without making it sound completely insane. Released in 1999, D2 is a strange mixture of survival horror, action-adventure and first-person shooting. You play as Laura Parton, who finds herself stranded in a snowy Canadian wilderness following a mysterious plane crash, and from there things get very weird very quickly. What makes it interesting isn't necessarily that every part of it has aged perfectly. It definitely hasn't. The controls can feel a bit clunky, some of the mechanics are unusual, and the game has some strange moments. But that's exactly why I think it's worth revisiting. D2 has an atmosphere that's difficult to find anywhere else. The snowy environments, the isolation, the bizarre creatures, and the genuinely unsettling story all give it a very distinctive identity. It's also one of those games where you really don't know what you're going to see next, and that's something I love about older games. They weren't afraid to be weird. D2 isn't a perfect game, but if you're looking for something completely different from the usual Dreamcast recommendations, this is definitely worth checking out. Coming in at number 9, we have Armada, and this is probably one of the most interesting games on the entire list. Imagine taking a space shooter, mixing it with RPG mechanics, adding exploration, and then dropping everything into a large space environment. That's basically it. You start out in space with your ship, taking on enemies, collecting weapons and upgrades, completing missions and gradually becoming more powerful. But what makes it stand out is the feeling that you're actually exploring, rather than simply moving from one level to the next. There's a real sense of freedom. You can improve your ship, experiment with different weapons and decide how you want to approach the game. There's also multiplayer for up to 4 players, which gives Armada another interesting dimension if you've got people to play with. Armada also has that unmistakable late 90s Dreamcast charm. It doesn't have the polish of some of Sega's biggest releases, but it has ideas, and sometimes that's more interesting. If you've played every obvious Dreamcast game and you're looking for something that feels different, Armada is absolutely worth discovering. It may not have become a household name, but that's precisely what makes finding it today so rewarding.
Mission objective detected.
Coming in at number 8 is Draconus, a game that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. It's an action-adventure game built around sword fighting, exploration and some light puzzle solving. You take control of a warrior in a fantasy world filled with enemies, secrets and plenty of places to explore. And this is exactly the sort of game I love finding on older consoles. It doesn't try to reinvent the wheel, instead it takes that classic action-adventure formula and gives it a very Dreamcast era presentation. You've got colourful environments, large areas to explore, weapons to find and plenty of enemies to fight. There are also moments where you'll need to explore and figure things out rather than simply charging forward. There's something very charming about the way Dreamcast games attempted 3D adventure games in this period. They don't always have the smoothness of modern games, but they have personality, and this has plenty of it. This game is a great example of why you shouldn't judge the Dreamcast library purely by the famous games. There's a whole second tier of titles that never received the same attention. If you're a fan of old school action adventures, it's definitely one to put on your radar.
Funny thing is, that was my plan too.
At number 7, things get considerably more ridiculous. This is Techromancer, Capcom's giant robot fighting game. If you're a fan of classic super robot anime and massive robots punching each other through buildings, you're probably going to love this. Techromancer is essentially Capcom taking the arcade fighting formula and giving it a giant mecha makeover. You've got massive robots, colourful attacks, destructible environments and an exaggerated anime presentation that feels like you've just stepped into a classic Japanese super robot show. But there's more here than just presentation. The fighting itself is surprisingly accessible, which makes it a great game to pick up and play without needing to spend hours learning complicated mechanics. And visually it has aged in a pretty interesting way. It doesn't look realistic, and that's actually part of its charm. Everything is bright and deliberately over the top. It's also a game that perfectly represents something the Dreamcast did really well, bringing Japanese arcade experiences into your living room. If you missed it when the Dreamcast was around, there's a good chance you've never even seen it before, and that's a shame, because Techromancer is one of those games that makes you wonder how something this entertaining managed to slip through the cracks. So if giant robots are something you love, this one is absolutely worth playing. At number 6, we have Project Justice, and if you're into fighting games, pay attention to this one. Project Justice is the sequel to Rival Schools, and it's one of Capcom's more unusual fighters. Instead of going for the traditional martial arts tournament setup, you have high school characters, rival teams and an anime style world. But what makes Project Justice really special is how much personality it has. You won't forget the characters, the attacks are ridiculous in the best possible way, and the team-based fighting system gives matches a lot of variety. This isn't one of those dark, serious fighting games where every character looks miserable. Project Justice is energetic, playful and packed with characters. And because it's a Capcom game, the actual fighting is excellent. The Dreamcast was home to some fantastic fighting games, but when people talk about the console, Project Justice often gets pushed aside by the bigger names. That's what makes it such a good hidden gem. If you've already played Soul Calibur and you're looking for something different, Project Justice is an easy recommendation. It has the perfect combination of arcade gameplay, great characters and sheer personality. I'd love to see Capcom bring this series back. We're halfway through the list, and at number 5 we've got one of the strangest games on the Dreamcast, IllBleed, and believe me, strange is definitely the word. It's a survival horror game, but instead of simply walking through creepy corridors and fighting monsters, you're basically entering a giant horror theme park filled with deadly traps. When you think about it, a horror theme park, the idea sounds completely ridiculous, but also piques your interest. You have to explore different horror attractions while trying to spot traps before they kill you. The game constantly messes with your expectations, and you never quite know what ridiculous thing is waiting around the corner. It's also got a wonderfully bizarre cast of characters, and a story that feels like someone threw every horror movie idea they could think of into a blender, but underneath all that madness is a genuinely interesting game. It rewards observation. You can't simply run around blindly because the environment itself is trying to kill you. And visually, it has that unmistakable Dreamcast look that makes it even more nostalgic. But if you enjoy unusual survival horror games and you're bored of playing the same Resident Evil style experiences, this is something completely different. At number 4, we've got Cosmic Smash, and this might be the most stylish game on this list. The basic idea sounds incredibly simple. You're essentially playing a futuristic combination of squash and breakout, smashing a ball around a series of arenas and destroying blocks before time runs out. But Sega somehow turned that simple idea into one of the coolest looking arcade games on the Dreamcast. The futuristic presentation is a big part of the appeal. You've got clean environments, bright colours, electronic music and a visual style that feels like something from a futuristic sports movie. And because the gameplay is so straightforward, you can pick it up almost immediately. There's no big story to learn, no complicated skill tree, no massive tutorial, you simply play. And sometimes that's exactly what you want. Cosmic Smash also has that classic arcade quality where you're constantly trying to improve your score and get further than you did the last time. It's the kind of game that could easily become addictive once you get into its rhythm. What's amazing is that a game this stylish and unusual isn't talked about more often when people discuss the Dreamcast. It's definitely not a conventional sports game, and that's part of the reason I think it's worth discovering. If you're looking for something completely different, Cosmic Smash is an absolute must play. At number 3, we have Evil Twin Cyprian's Chronicles. This is one of those games that makes you wonder how you managed to miss it. You play as a young orphan who's struggling with the loss of his parents. On his birthday, his friends try to cheer him up with a party, but things take a very strange turn when they are transported into a bizarre world. And from there, the game becomes a mixture of platforming, exploration, combat and some bizarre environments. One of the things I really like about Evil Twin is its atmosphere. It's colourful, but there's also something slightly unsettling about it. The world feels like a twisted version of a children's story, and that gives the game a personality that a lot of similar 3D platformers don't have. The game isn't perfect, the controls could take some getting used to, and there are definitely moments where you can tell this isn't one of the biggest budget releases of the era. But when you look past those rough edges, it's a really interesting game, and that's exactly what we're looking for in a hidden gem. It's unusual, it's atmospheric, and it's different. If you've played the obvious Dreamcast platformers and you're looking for something that feels unfamiliar, Evil Twin is one I'd strongly recommend hunting down. At number 2 is Record of Lodoss War, and if you're a fan of classic action RPGs, this is one you really shouldn't overlook. Based on the Japanese fantasy series of the same name, it takes a very different approach from the colourful platformers and arcade games that usually get associated with the Dreamcast. This is darker, more traditional fantasy adventure. The gameplay has a strong action RPG influence with real-time combat, equipment and character progression, plus plenty of enemies to fight. And there's something incredibly satisfying about simply exploring the world, finding better equipment and becoming stronger. It's also one of those games where the Dreamcast library starts to feel much bigger than people remember. There were genuinely interesting RPGs and adventure games on the system that never became household names. This is one of them. If you're someone who enjoys the combat-heavy style of games like Diablo or classic dungeon-crawling action RPGs, there's a very good chance you'll find something to enjoy here. It might not have the same recognition of the biggest Dreamcast games, but once you discover it, it's easy to understand why collectors still talk about it. Taking the number 1 spot is Under Defeat. And if you've never played it before, this is one Dreamcast hidden gem that deserves your attention. Under Defeat is a military-style vertical shoot-'em-up where you control a helicopter and take on wave after wave of enemies. The controls are responsive, the action is intense, and the game has a fantastic sense of atmosphere. You're constantly surrounded by explosions, enemy fire, and things moving across the screen, but the game still feels incredibly controlled. The helicopter also has a really satisfying sense of weight to it, which makes the combat feel different from many other shoot-'em-ups. And visually it's still impressive. You've got detailed environments, big explosions, lots of enemies, and an excellent sense of scale. But here's something that makes it even more interesting. The Dreamcast version wasn't released until 2006, several years after Sega had discontinued the console. It was even marketed as the last Dreamcast game, although other releases followed afterwards. And that's part of what makes this such a fascinating game. It represents the dedication that still existed around the Dreamcast years after Sega had moved on. The game itself is challenging, polished and addictive, and it feels fantastic to play. So if you've worked your way through the obvious Dreamcast classics, do yourself a favour and give Under Defeat a try. Some of these you might already know, but hopefully there were at least a few that were completely new to you. The Dreamcast had such a fantastic library, and I think it's easy to forget just how many unusual and overlooked games were released for the system. Did I miss one of your favourite Dreamcast hidden gems? Let me know your picks in the comments, because there are so many games that could have made this list. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.